Hey fellas, how's it going? I know it's been a little while again since my last video. I think last time I posted was like 5 or 6 months ago, something like that. Yeah, sorry about it. I've just been very busy with work lately and just haven't had the time or the motivation to make anything until now. And I have had this concept on the channel before of a hard body paddle tail lure. And I wanted to explore this concept a little bit further and make a lure that has a hinge on the paddle tail piece, just to see how it would swim. So that's what we're gonna make today. A hard body paddle tail jointed lure thing. I don't know what to call this. Anyways, let's just jump right into it and I'll show you how to make one of these guys. So obviously every single lure design starts with a sketch, and I already had this kind of a concept in my mind what I wanted to make, so it honestly didn't take me too long to sketch this out. Maybe 15 to 10 minutes, something like that. And we're just going to transfer this sketch into this piece of maple that I had lying around from a previous project that I had made. Now that I have all of the outlines sketched out on this piece of maple, which is actually two pieces sandwiched together, because I wanted to make sure that I have enough meat to fulfill my vision or whatever. Anyways, yeah, I'm just going to cut it out with a bandsaw. Nothing really too exciting or revolutionary about that. Alright, next we're gonna head out to the disc sander and smooth out some of those rougher edges on the profile that were left behind from the bandsaw blade. And I think it's getting a little dull, even though this is maple and pretty tough. You usually wouldn't see this if the blade was actually sharp. So I think I'm gonna have to go and buy a new one at some point. But not yet. I think I'm just gonna use this until it snaps in half, because that's just how I roll and I'm a cheap ass. So at this point I figured it would be a good time to separate the two halves, or the paddle section in this case, because obviously this is still a square block and getting a straight cut is fairly easy. And still taking advantage of this blockiness of this lure, I'm just going to drill a couple of, no, not couple, actually just one pilot hole. What am I thinking here? Yeah, it must be all the coffee that I've been drinking while recording this. Anyways, complete different tangent. Ignore that. Let's just move on and plow through this. We can do it. Alright, next we're gonna head out to the bandsaw and do a little bit of cutting. But before that, I'm just going to draw out the up profile outlines to, help me out a little bit. And like before, I'm just going to smoothen everything out with my disc sander afterwards. And I'm actually going to use the disc sander to do some beveling as well. Wow, that was a little bit of Sean Connery right there. Interesting. The spirit is talking through me. Or something. Or it could be that I just can't talk English properly. Oh well. Next up, we're gonna tackle the tail. That actually sounds wrong. Now that oh wow, okay. I don't know how to describe it any other way. But yeah, I'm just going to trace out the outlines. I'm just gonna eyeball it because I couldn't with making the actual thing. What is it called? Stencil? I don't know why I couldn't remember that, but it is what it is. Anyways, and I'm just going to use my bandsaw to cut it out again. How exciting, I know. Alright, next I'm gonna continue rounding off the lure even further and just gonna use my knife with this and to get it like a nice round shape to it. Although it's more like an oval actually. Or now that I think of it, it's actually more like a triangle. Anyways, it's a shape. Next I decided to start working on the tail a little bit more, and I'm just going to use my Dremel tool to achieve that goal. And yeah, I'm just going to use this grinding disc, or is it more like a wheel? I don't know. Probably doesn't even matter, but anyways, I'm just using that. Alright, so now that we have the tail out of the way, so to speak, I can start moving on to the next stage, which is carving. And what I always do, if you've seen any of my other videos, I start from the eye sockets, so that's what we're doing now. I'm drilling the eye sockets with a 7mm drill bit. So when I do my carvings, I always use a stencil for that, and I'm just going to use this sketch that I made earlier and use that as the stencil. This is just to help me align everything more accurately, because obviously I have to do this in both sides, and I'm a bit of an OCD and kind of want everything to be perfect, so that's the reason why I usually do it like this. I probably could do it free-handed too, maybe. I could be delusional too. Who knows? I don't know. It's just something I've been doing a lot, and it's one of those things that's kind of second nature to me at this point, so I just go with what I know. So now that I have all the guidelines drawn on the bait, or lure, I remember someone taking a big offense on me using the word bait on a fishing lure. I don't know. People are weird. Anyways, I got completely sidetracked again. Must be that coffee. Anyways, what I was talking about. Oh, yes. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to cut along these guidelines, and then I'm just going to cut behind them and reveal a beautiful carved fish type of thing. Actually, I don't know what sort of fish this is supposed to be. I think it's kind of similar to a herring or something like that. Not really sure. It is kind of like a fantasy fish, I guess. Before doing any carving, I'm actually going to erase all of the pen marks from the lure. And what this does is actually makes all the graphite from the pen to go into the crevices and the cut marks, and make them a little bit more crisp and easier to see where everything is. And this is a really good trick, and it makes a hell of a big difference actually, to be able to see everything nice and crisp. You will be able to carve much more delicate and finer details if you do this. For example, the mouth area that I'm carving right now is usually very delicate and has a lot of small little fine details. Maybe not so much on this piece in particular, but maybe some other species, like for example a roach or maybe even a carp has a very small and fine details around their mouth. And using this little trick of erasing all the pencil marks is a really huge help achieving all that kind of small detail carving awesomeness. Now that I've finished with the head details, I'm just going to smooth everything out with this custom-made sanding stick. Yeah, I know, it doesn't sound very good, let's be honest. Custom-made sanding stick. I definitely have to come up with a better way of saying that, but I can't think of anything right now. Yeah, let me know in the comment section what you would call this. I'm sure that there's people out there who have much better imagination than I do with naming things. Alright, we're almost at the point where I can start carving the scales. But before that, I need to mark where the lateral line is going to be. So that's what I'm doing right now. So the goal here is to make this kind of a grid pattern that I can then use to draw the scales on the side of the lure. And first, what I need to do is I need to determine what sort of size I'm going to go with. And I decided to go with 4 millimeters. And now actually looking back at it in retrospect, I think I should have gone with 3 millimeters because I think it would have looked better. But you know, I think 4 is okay. Now that I have the size of the scales determined, I can start drawing the grid pattern. And what I have here is a custom-made stencil to help me get all of the angles correctly, because you want to kind of aim for a diamond shape when you do scales. It just looks more natural that way. And oftentimes when I would do this free-handed, I would kind of end up with a square. And when you do a scale on that, it just looks absolutely horrible. Alright, so now that I have the angles drawn in properly, and I have a starting point for finishing off the grid pattern, I'm just going to do exactly that. Now that I have the scale grid pattern in place, it's time to start marking them out and drawing the scales in the grid pattern. And I think I probably could do this and start carving right now, but I just feel more confident having a kind of a visual representation of what I'm supposed to carve and where it's supposed to go. So maybe some points I will be good enough and I won't need to do this anymore. But that time is not here yet. You know, I oftentimes get asked, how long does it take for you to carve something like this? And this time around, I actually ended up counting how many hours it actually took me to complete the whole carving process. And to be honest, this one is actually pretty simple and kind of fast, so it didn't take me too long to do. So in all, it took me 7.5 hours to complete the whole carving process. You know, it's funny, more you do these kind of realistic carving projects, there are certain things that you just can't miss anymore, and that is to make the lateral line. In my case, I can't have a lure without a lateral line anymore. It's just one of those things that I have to add. So what I'm just gonna do now is I'm going to basically just use my knife to puncture or punch in holes that will then resemble a lateral line. Initially, I was thinking of doing a full through wire construction, but then I was thinking, you know what, this is just gonna be a kind of an experiment, so it doesn't have to be all that durable. So I just decided to use screw eyes. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm just going to drill some holes for those screw eyes. You know, this is a first for me. I usually always use epoxy to fix my screw eyes into my lures, but you know, this time around I figured since this is going to be kind of an experiment anyways, it doesn't have to be super durable, so I'm just going to use super glue. Initially I was thinking of making this a kind of a top water thing, but then I figured, you know what, this is gonna be better if it actually sinks. But before that, I need to seal the lure. And yeah, that's what I'm doing right now. I'm basically just gonna use this spray on acrylic lacquer to seal the wood. In the end, I ended up spraying 4 layers of that acrylic lacquer on this lure to make sure that it definitely doesn't take in water when I do the weighing test, which I'm doing right now. When I was done with the weighing test, where I determined how much weight I would want to have on the lure and where it should be, I changed my mind. And at this point, I thought that it's gonna be easier if I fill up the holes at this point and then just add more lead later. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm just gonna fill them out with Bondo and yeah, put more weight inside and make this sink a little bit more level than it is right now. And actually it's not sinking at all, it's still floating at this point. I ended up adding 7 more grams of lead into the lure to make it sink. And as you can see, it's kind of nose heavy at this point, which is actually what I want. Because past experience has shown me that lures that have a fixed tail such as this kind of always want to go to the surface. So in order for me to kind of counter that, I wanted to sink nose heavy, if that makes sense. Alright, check this out. I decided to build myself a spraying booth this summer, and I was able to find these cool LED lights that I slapped onto the roof of this thing in various angles, and you can actually control it with motion. I mean, how cool is that? Most of you who watch my channel already know that I'm really a sucker for all of these natural paint jobs, and that's what we're gonna do today. I'm gonna start with a black base because usually if you use any kind of metallic colors, they pop a little bit better when you use a black base. For this lure I wanted to have kind of like a transition between wood and the fish, So I'm actually not going to paint all the way through, and I'm just going to use this Vallejo Chrome, which is probably one of my favorite metallic colors to use. It's really bright and very silvery, because a lot of the metallic colors that you might be using are kind of dull, and this one is not. It's actually very bright, and I think it makes a really nice silvery base for any kind of baitfish pattern that you might be making. Next we're going to do my favorite new technique, which is black wash. And I use this technique on pretty much every single lure that I make nowadays that has some sort of carved details. It just has this awesome way of making everything pop, especially the scales. And I used to buy black wash paints, but now I make them myself with just normal paint. You just mix 50-50 ratio of airbrush cleaner and the paint. And you still want to kind of make sure that you do this pretty fast, because obviously acrylic paint, if you know, wants to stick to everything, and it dries fairly fast. So I usually dab the piece of cloth or tissue in the airbrush cleaner to make sure that I get all of the paint out from the spots that I don't want the paint to be in. And also what you didn't see me do is I primed the surfaces with that acrylic lacquer that I use for the sealing, just to make sure that when I start doing the wiping, the silver base doesn't come off. Now that I'm done with the black wash, I'm gonna move on to the belly. And I usually try to do this kind of like a gradual shift or change between the white belly and the silver side. So I usually go with very opaque on the very top or very bottom, depending on where you look at it, and have this kind of a nice gradual change, so that if I end up doing some other color in there, like pearl white, which I will do, it's gonna have a really nice gradual natural shift to it. So it will look more natural, I guess, lack of a better word. Like I mentioned a few moments ago, I want to have this kind of like a nice gradual shift between the chrome silver and the white belly. So in order to achieve that, I'm just going to spray some of this white pearlescent color into this transition area. I'm sure many of you who are trying to achieve these natural looking baitfish patterns have noticed that a lot of these species have a lot of interesting sheens to them. You might have blues, you might have greens, you might have purples in them. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to add a layer of this color shift blue on the flank of this baitfish. Next I'm going to move on to the back, and I'm just going to use this Russian brown, which is a really awesome earthy kind of dark brown that actually a lot of baitfish species have some of this in them. So naturally I'm just going to add this one in here as well. I'm sure you still remember a few moments ago I was talking about different sheens on these baitfish. So I'm just going to add this color shift green to this. I usually actually don't use green a lot when I do these paint jobs. It's usually always blue. But so I just decided to change things up a little bit and have a little fun. I recently went a little crazy and bought a lot of new paints, and among them were actually a lot of Createx paints, which is interesting because for the longest time I used to hate these paints. I don't know, maybe they changed something in their formula or something, because these are actually really awesome paints. Um, I don't know, maybe when I was starting out, maybe my airbrush was, too crappy to handle these or something. I don't know. Anyways, I choose this midnight blue because, like I was saying earlier, you kind of want to have this gradual change between colors when you do realistic paint jobs. And this ended up looking actually much better than I anticipated it. In order to make the painting process of the fins a little bit faster and possibly more accurate, I decided to create two separate stencils that I can just slap on each side of the bait. And I'm just going to use masking tape, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the original stencil to first spray some black paint on the masking tape, and then just cutting it out with a hobby knife. Now that I have the masking tape in place, it's really easy to just start spraying the fin rays, which I'm just going to use the Russian brown that I used earlier, and also I'm just going to use a little bit of black on the tips, or the beginning of the fin, to make it look a little bit more 3D, I guess, and make it look less flat. And I recently actually bought a new needle to my airbrush, and I am so glad that I did, because this is so much easier than it was before, let me tell you. And here I'm doing the final little shadings with black to make the fins pop a little bit more. Oftentimes these baitfish don't really have a lot of color in their fins, or they're actually not very visible. They're kind of see-through, kind of iridescent, but I didn't want to do that for this one, so I just went with my gut and went with something I like personally. Now that I'm done with the painting itself, I'm just going to glue in some eyes with super glue. And I usually have an excess of eyes, so I actually didn't have to paint or make any for this project. I was fortunate enough to have some extras, which is always nice. So, one last thing we need to do before I can start testing this lure out and assemble it, and that is to completely and utterly cover it with epoxy. And I'm still using True Coat epoxy. I think it's the best epoxy out there for lure making at the moment. And I think I'm gonna leave a link in the description box, so you can go ahead and click that link and be your own judge. See if this is the lure epoxy for you. I definitely like it, and I think you will too. It is roughly 14 hours since I put the lures into the rotation wheel to dry, and now they're completely hard. What I actually did is I had this small heater in front of the rotation wheel. I set it up to 24 degrees and basically had that blasting on the lures, which makes them cure faster, because epoxy, like the True Coat, will react to heat, which is really nice. Anyways, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to drill holes to the back piece. These holes are going to be slightly bigger than the ones that I'm going to be drilling on the main piece, to which I'm going to actually screw in the screw eyes. But in the back piece, the holes are going to be slightly bigger because I have two screw eyes, so obviously I can't screw them into the back piece, so I have to make the back holes slightly bigger. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to fill them with epoxy, and that should be enough for them to actually hold in place. And the last thing I need to do is I'm just going to glue in the screw eyes. And like I said before, I'm just going to screw in the first screw eyes into the main piece and then fill the other holes in the back with epoxy and just basically just jam the screw eyes in. And that should be good enough for them to hold in place for my little tests. Alrighty, it's time to do the traditional swim test, and as you can see, this lure has a kind of a weird wobbling action, kind of like a crankbait, but not really. I mean, I was actually expecting for the tail to do a little bit more side-to-side waggle that it is doing right now. I mean, it's doing a little bit, but not too much. Which leads me to an idea that I want to do. I want to do some more experiments and modifications on this lure, and I will publish that as a Patreon exclusive. So if you want to become a Patreon supporter and see that, feel free. And hope you guys enjoyed the video. Like the video if you did. Subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and see you guys on the next one. Hopefully it doesn't take me too long to publish again, but you never know.